Most people believe power is loud. They think it shows up in raised voices, quick comebacks, or the ability to dominate a moment. But if you study human behavior closely, you start to notice a very different pattern. The individuals who carry the most influence are often the least reactive. They don't rush to respond. They don't mirror aggression. They don't get pulled into emotional exchanges that others initiate. And that's not accidental, it's controlled. When you react emotionally, you reveal something very valuable: predictability. The moment someone knows what triggers you, they gain leverage over you. This is one of the simplest principles of behavioral psychology. Predictable systems are controllable systems. If a person can provoke you and reliably get a reaction, they now have a tool they can use whenever they choose. And most people never realize they're handing that tool over. Think about how quickly people defend themselves when questioned, or how fast they respond when they feel disrespected. That speed feels like strength, but it's actually a lack of control. It means the environment is dictating your internal state. You're not choosing your response, the situation is choosing it for you. And once that pattern is established, it becomes your identity in the eyes of others. Reactive, readable, and easy to influence. Now contrast that with someone who pauses, someone who doesn't immediately engage. There's a moment of silence, a gap where a reaction would normally be. That gap is where power lives. Because in that space, you're demonstrating something most people struggle with: self-regulation. You're showing that your emotional state is not up for negotiation. It's not something that can be accessed or altered on demand by external pressure. This is deeply connected to attachment patterns. Individuals with anxious attachment often feel an internal urgency to respond, to correct, to defend. There's a fear that if they don't react, they'll lose control of how they're perceived. But that urgency is exactly what gives others influence over them. On the other side, a more secure pattern shows up as calm, measured behavior. There's no rush to fix every misunderstanding or answer every provocation, because there's no internal threat driving the response. And here's where it becomes strategic. When you stop reacting, people lose their script. Most social interactions operate on predictable loop: stimulus and response. Someone pushes, you push back. Someone criticizes, you defend. But when that loop breaks, when the expected reaction doesn't come, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty forces people to reassess. They start paying more attention. They start questioning their assumptions. In many cases, they start assigning higher value to the person they can't easily read. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. It means you become selective. You respond when it serves a purpose, not when you're emotionally compelled. You speak when it adds value, not when you feel pressured to fill silence. And that distinction is everything, because now your behavior is intentional, not reactive. Over time, this shifts how people treat you. They test you less because the usual tactics don't work. They respect your boundaries more because they can't bypass them through emotional triggers. And most importantly, you begin to trust yourself more because you're no longer at the mercy of every external stimulus. Emotional control isn't about suppressing what you feel. It's about deciding what deserves expression. And in a world where most people react without thinking, the one who remains composed becomes the one in control. If you pay attention to how people communicate under pressure, you'll notice a pattern that's almost universal. The moment someone feels misunderstood, judged, or questioned, they begin to explain. They add context, they justify their decisions, they try to make sure every detail is clear. On the surface, it seems reasonable, almost responsible. But underneath that behavior is something far more revealing. The need to explain is often the need to be approved of. And that's where the shift in power begins. Because the more you explain yourself, the more you signal that your position requires validation. You're no longer simply stating reality as you see it or negotiating for acceptance. And people pick up on that instantly, even if they can't articulate it. Human beings are exceptionally good at detecting subtle cues of uncertainty. When your communication becomes layered with justification, it introduces doubt where there may not have been any. There's a psychological principle at play here. Confidence is often interpreted not by what is said, but by what is left unsaid. When someone delivers a message without over-elaboration, it creates an impression of certainty. It suggests that their understanding is stable, that their position doesn't depend on external agreement. But when someone begins stacking explanations, adding reasons, circling back to clarify, it creates the opposite effect. It feels like they're trying to convince rather than simply communicate. And convincing is a lower status behavior than stating. This becomes even more pronounced in individuals with anxious attachment patterns. There's often an internal pressure to make sure they're seen correctly, to prevent misinterpretation at all costs. So they overcorrect. They fill silence with more words, thinking that clarity will create security. But what it often creates instead is exposure. The more you talk, the more material you provide for others to evaluate, question, or even challenge. Meanwhile, the person who says less maintains control over the frame of the interaction. Silence, in this context, isn't emptiness at structure. It forces the other person to engage without being guided through every detail. It creates space for interpretation, and here's the paradox. People often assign greater value to what they have to interpret themselves. When you don't over-explain, others tend to fill in the gaps in ways that elevate your position. They assume competence, certainty, and authority because nothing in your behavior suggests otherwise. This doesn't mean you avoid communication or become vague for the sake of appearing powerful. It means you remove the unnecessary. You say what needs to be said, and then you stop. You resist the impulse to add that extra sentence just in case. You allow your words to stand on their own without reinforcement. And that restraint changes the dynamic, because now, instead of trying to manage how others perceive you, you're allowing them to reveal how they perceive you. If someone misunderstands, that's information. If someone challenges, that's information. You're no longer scrambling to control every outcome you're observing, selecting, and responding with intention. Over time, this builds a very specific kind of presence. People stop expecting long explanations from you. They stop pushing for justification because they learn it won't come. And in that absence, something interesting happens. Your words carry more weight. When you do choose to elaborate, it feels deliberate. It feels important. Because it's no longer your default mode, it's a conscious decision. And that's the real shift. You move from reacting to perception to defining it through restraint. Explanations feel safe, but they often come at the cost of authority because every extra word is a small concession, a subtle attempt to secure agreement. And the moment you stop needing that agreement, your communication changes entirely. It becomes cleaner, sharper, and far more effective. Say what matters, leave the rest. There's a misunderstanding around the idea of ignoring. Most people hear that word and associate it with avoidance, passivity, or even weakness. They imagine someone who can't handle confrontation, so they withdraw. But that's not what we're talking about here. Strategic ignoring is not about escaping reality, it's about selecting it. It's the deliberate act of choosing what deserves your attention, and more importantly, what doesn't. Attention is one of the most valuable resources you have, and yet most people spend it impulsively. Every notification, every comment, every subtle provocation gets a response. Not because it matters, but because it's there. And over time, this creates a pattern where your focus is constantly being hijacked by low-value inputs. You're not directing your attention, you're reacting to whoever or whatever demands it loud enough. If someone can reliably get your attention, they can influence your behavior. That's the underlying mechanism behind provocation. Whether it's criticism, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive remarks, the goal is often the same: to pull you into an interaction on their terms. And the moment you engage without intention, you've accepted that frame. You're now playing a role in a script you didn't write. Ignoring breaks that script. When you choose not to respond, especially in situations where a reaction is expected, you disrupt the pattern. The other person is left without feedback, without reinforcement, without the emotional exchange they were anticipating. And this creates a kind of psychological friction. People are used to cause and effect in social interactions. They say something, something happens in return. But when nothing happens, it forces them to confront that absence. And absence is powerful. It creates space for reflection, for uncertainty, for recalibration. The person who initiated the interaction now has to process it without your participation. They might question whether their approach worked, whether you noticed, whether you cared. And in many cases, they assign more significance to your silence than they would have to any response you could have given. This is where the distinction becomes important. Ignoring is not about pretending something didn't happen. It's about recognizing that not everything deserves engagement. It's a filter. You're constantly assessing. Does this align with my priorities, my standards, my direction? If the answer is no, then it doesn't get access to your time or your energy. That kind of selectivity reflects a high level of emotional intelligence. It shows that your internal state isn't dependent on external noise. You're not compelled to react just because something is presented to you, and that's a defining trait of secure attachment. There's no urgency to resolve every tension, no need to respond to every perceived slight. There's a quiet confidence in letting things pass without interference. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore everything. That would be indifference, and indifference has its own cost. The key is discernment. You engage where it matters, where there's value, where there's alignment. But you disengage from what's designed to distract, provoke, or diminish your focus. And that boundary becomes visible over time. People begin to understand that access to your attention is not automatic, it's earned. And once that understanding is established, your environment starts to change. The frequency of low-value interactions decreases. The quality of conversations improves. And most importantly, your mental space becomes more controlled. You're no longer fragmented across dozens of unnecessary exchanges. You're concentrated, intentional, and far more effective in the areas that actually matter. Strategic ignoring is not about silence for the sake of silence. It's about protecting your focus with precision. Because every moment you choose not to engage is a moment you reclaim for something more important. And in a world that constantly competes for your attention, the ability to withhold it is a form of power few people ever develop. Once you begin to consistently apply these principles controlling your reactions, reducing unnecessary explanations, and filtering what you engage with, something subtle but powerful starts to happen beneath the surface of your interactions. The dynamic shifts, not because you forced it to, but because you've removed the patterns that made you easy to predict. Most social environments run on predictability. People learn each other's emotional rhythms, their triggers, their habits. They figure out what gets a response, what creates pressure, what leads to compliance. And once those patterns are mapped, interactions become less about connection and more about influence. It's quiet, often unspoken, but it's always there. When you stop reacting the way people expect, that map becomes useless. And this is where detachment enters, not as coldness, not as disinterest, but as discipline. Detachment is the ability to remain internally stable regardless of external behavior. It means your identity, your mood, your decisions are not constantly being adjusted in response to other people's actions. You're no longer tethered to the emotional climate around you. That independence creates a kind of ambiguity. People can't quite figure you out the way they used to. The usual inputs don't produce the usual outputs. And when predictability disappears, attention increases. Humans are naturally drawn to what they can't easily decode. It triggers curiosity, and in many cases, respect. But it's important to understand this isn't about becoming mysterious for the sake of it. Manufactured unpredictability is just another form of performance, and people can sense that. What we're talking about is something more grounded. It's the natural byproduct of someone who is no longer reacting out of habit or insecurity. Your behavior becomes less about others and more about alignment with your own standards. And that's what recalibrates the dynamic. Because now interactions with you require a different level of presence. People can't rely on shortcuts or emotional leverage. They have to engage more directly, more honestly, because the usual methods don't apply. Over time, this changes how you're treated. Not because you demanded respect, but because your behavior made anything less ineffective. There's also a deeper psychological shift happening within you. As you detach from the need to respond, explain, or engage with everything, you start to experience a kind of internal quiet. The constant evaluation, what do they think? Did I handle that right? Should I say more? Begins to fade. And in that quiet, your decisions become clearer. You're no longer navigating through layers of external noise. This is where real confidence is built. Not from controlling outcomes, but from knowing you don't need to. And when you operate from that place, your presence changes. You're not seeking attention, but you're not avoiding it either. You're not trying to influence, but you naturally do, because people sense stability. They sense when someone is grounded enough to remain, unaffected by things that would normally create tension or reaction. That's what makes detachment so effective. It's not aggressive, it's not forceful, but it's incredibly difficult to challenge. There's nothing to push against. No emotional hooks to grab onto. And without those hooks, attempts to control or provoke simply fall flat. Over time, this creates a boundary that doesn't need to be announced. It's understood. People recognize that your attention, your engagement, your emotional energy these are not things they can access at will. They have to meet a certain level to receive it. And that's the shift from being influenced to being respected. Detachment isn't about disconnecting from people. It's about disconnecting from the need to be affected by them. It's a quiet form of control, one that doesn't rely on force or persuasion, but on consistency and self-regulation. When you reach that point, the dynamic is no longer something you react to, it's something you define. And the moment you stop needing control is the moment you finally have it.